Wow. Wow. What a great crowd. It's nice to see you all. A lot of you I know, most of you know Frances. It's just great to see such a friendly and interested and receptive audience. Frances, as you know, has lived a remarkable life. She spent most of the last 40 years in Nepal just learning, discovering, experiencing the culture, the Nepalese culture, the Sherpa culture, and she has spent much of that time helping the people of Nepal through through CORE, her NGO. It's been a remarkable life. She has contributed so much, and she's going to share it with us tonight. Welcome, Frances. So we've been preparing for this. I am nothing if not prepared. As they say in an interview, you never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. You don't want to be surprised. But no, Frances and I have done about 4 prep sessions. And the first question I was going to ask Frances is, why Nepal? What was it about that country and those people that just took your life for 40 years? Yeah.
That's a good question. There are days when I wonder as well. I didn't plan it that way. I never had plans to stay, initially. When I went having just finished my bachelor's degree to Europe, I did have this inkling like, oh, I like this place because it's so easy to go to many different cultures in Europe. And then was working for parks and went trekking in Nepal. And I went for the mountains. But in all honesty, I stayed for the people. And the people and how they engage with the land, how their belief systems, and honor the power of nature and honor the land. And I was back in Canmore for 7 years, 1989 to 95. But when I was offered work to go back to Nepal, it was really the work I would be doing was much more compelling than what I would do here. Here a little bit with the national parks, there was serious conservation issues. But in Nepal, there was people's subsistence depending on the land. A lot of the issues were very compelling. So that sort of grabbed me initially. And then looking at different cultures, initially we'd often look at the differences from our culture to their culture and how people do things differently. But ultimately, I started to see that what was really most important was the inside culture and just the commonalities that we have with people wherever they are. The cycles of life, birth, death, marriages, whatever, and the cycles of the year, all of those things are important. And people, wherever you go, celebrate those keynotes in a lifetime and in a year. Right. So, we'll talk about it later, but I started a publishing company and didn't think it would survive 2 years, and it's 24 years later, it's still running.
Okay, wow. Well, we'll get to that, and we'll go through your wonderful experiences in Nepal. But first, a little bit about your background. You were born in Calgary in 1954.
Right.
Yeah. You just celebrated your birthday, actually, a few days ago.
Sunday,
yeah.
I had a great time with Jeff Powder.
Oh, good.
Talking to Ming Maji.
Oh, good. So tell me a little bit about growing up in Calgary and your parents and those early years.
We were we were very lucky in that our parents, my sister's here, our parents were both teachers, and they loved the mountains. They really got into the mountains. And also we lived on the edge of the city, what's now called Nose Hill Park. So we were able to, as kids, 10-year-olds, to go out wandering up Nose Hill and tobogganing on our own.
Yeah.
So, there was a place for adventure close by. And our parents would do things like volunteer as house parents at the youth hostels, Ramparts Creek, things like that. And we would go for hikes. I remember hating going for hikes because our dad would spend hours lying on his... He was a very serious amateur photographer, and he'd spend hours lying on his stomach waiting for the wind to stop blowing so he could take a photograph of mountain avens.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it started then. And
yeah. So you went to the hostels. Your parents were both teachers, so they had the summer off.
So they had the summers off. Yeah.
And they spent lots of the summer as house parents at the hostels along the Icefields Parkway.
Some of the time, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And your father, as you said, was a very serious photographer, and you, as we'll discover later, have become a fabulous photographer too. You learned that from your father?
Well, he gave me first I had a Brownie camera when I was about 6, and then a Voigtlander. But especially with the Voigtlander camera, you had to judge the distance yourself for the focus, and you had to judge the aperture for the light. And he made me carry around the piece of paper from the roll of film in my pocket. Shadow, f5.6, bright light, f11, and so on. But later on, as I'll say, it stood me in good stead because living at Tengboche, the camera batteries would die, and
and you've got to know.
And there was no way to get new ones.
No, and then you got involved in your young years with the hostel group too. I was part of the hostel group about the same time, or maybe a little bit earlier. And in those days, the youth hostels was full of really strong skiers and climbers, and you were part of that group.
Right. We'd go out on... Well, because the hostel group was great. It had trips every weekend.
Yeah.
So it was easy, if you studied hard during the week, to go on a ski trip every weekend.
Yeah. And you were out there.
And stuff.
Yeah, you were out there in the backcountry with cross-country skis.
Right.
Wax.
Yeah.
No
Scraping your wax.
No.
The skins came along much later.
They did.
Much later.
They did.
Yeah.
I remember that. And just beating just up Baker Creek and down and
Or going up through Skokie and down.
And down Baker.
Down Baker and
Creek.
different places.
Yeah. So you got a real good grounding in the mountains, and then you went off to university. You were going to be a doctor.
I was actually, my teacher in grade 11 had said it was a writing class, and she said, you could be a good writer if you weren't being such a blockhead about wanting to go to medical school. She said that.
Yeah.
She later became a senator for Manitoba, Sharon Carstairs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you went to U of C.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you studied biology.
Mm-hmm. And did the usual drill for pre-med.
Yeah.
And then that's where I first met. Well, we'd all seen Chic, as the young underlings in the hostel group.
Yeah.
But then that was where I met you when you were my lab instructor.
Yeah, I actually was Francis's lab instructor in the mid 70s.
75 probably.
Yeah, at the University of Calgary, human physiology, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. But But you never went to med school. You didn't get there. Any reason why?
At U of C, it was a 3-year program, but you had to have your 4-year degree beforehand. And I had applied for med school. You could apply after your 3rd year. And I applied after my 3rd year, and I was 8 on the waiting list. And then it's like, sort of be careful what you wish for. Because all of a sudden people were saying, oh, don't worry, next year you'll get in for sure. And everybody was saying that to me, and it was like, oh, do I really want to do that?
Yeah, it's a big commitment.
Yeah, and I remember this dream of walking down a tunnel, and there were doors closing.
Yeah.
And this light that kept getting further away, and I just decided, okay, I need to take a year off. And then in that year, I got work with parks.
Yeah, and somewhere in there you went that year to Europe too.
And I went to Europe.
And you went to Europe and you discovered multiple cultures. You discovered how...
Variety. Greece, Italy, France.
Yeah, so you went all over, did you? Yeah.
Well, you've got to make the most of that Eurail pass.
Yeah. Good. And then, you... so you had your biology degree and you went to work with parks.
Right. Well, it was a few tries to get the job with parks.
Was it? Yeah.
And then I think I was with a friend and we were down to the Canyonlands in the States, and I called. In those days, of course, there was no email. Yeah. And I called my parents to see if a letter had arrived, and lo and behold, I was offered a job, a term job, so just for the summer, in Waterton.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my first choice of place, but I took the job, and in the end, it was really good to go to Waterton.
Yeah.
And learn different biological systems, a totally new place, instead of where I'd spent a lot of time already in Banff and Lake Louise.
Yeah, and you learned working for parks. You worked, 3 years for parks as an interpreter, and was it 3 years there?
6.
70.
77, 78, 79.
77 to 80.
83.
Oh, well, but in there we're missing.
I missed one winter.
You missed just one winter. Anyways, yeah. So in Waterton, you started learning the skills that served you so well later.
Right.
Yeah. You learned. Yeah, you learned. So you learned public speaking.
Well, because they sent us for a public speaking course.
Oh, did they?
In Jasper.
Yeah, and you were an interpreter.
And so we had to do the talks and the big campground talks.
Yeah. And you learned to create brochures and material and all that stuff that served you so well later. Yeah. And you met friends like Neil Colgan.
Neil and Heather Dempsey and...
Yeah. Is Heather here tonight?
Heather's here.
Oh, good. Yeah, there she is. Yeah, those were good years. Yeah.
And
Cindy, of course. Yes. Yeah. And then you went on the life-altering trip. Is that right? Was it life-altering?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Other friends who had seasonal jobs every winter would go traveling. And because I had a summer seasonal job and a winter seasonal job, I wasn't able to venture very far. And then they said, oh, but you'd really like Nepal. This was the fall of 1980. So I took leave from my winter seasonal job. And a bunch of colleagues from Jasper, where I'd been doing some work, we all took off to Nepal.
Okay, so you went with a group of people.
3 others, yeah.
Yeah, in October. Mm-hmm. To Khumbu. Yeah.
And walked in.
Yeah. Almost from Kathmandu, or?
It was Lano Sango. Yeah. So it was from the road that went up to Tibet.
Yeah.
at the time. And the Swiss project was building the first what was called Green Road, which was a hand-built road from Lamasango to go into what's that place called Jiri,
Yeah.
which shortened the walk-in by about 4 or 5 days.
Right. Right.
Eventually.
Yeah. And you got up there to Namche, I guess. Where did this all happen? Sagarmatha Park. Tell us
Because
about that.
Actually, before I got there, the winter before, in 1979, my sister and I were going to go to Nepal, but then I was offered work on the new exhibits for Bow Summit, and I thought, oh. So I did the career thing, and I took that job. So, but my sister went traveling on her own to New Zealand and met the Hillary family. There was in a mountain hut in a storm, and there was a film crew doing a film about Ed's life. And she became friends with Peter, the son. So Peter had sort of said, well, if you and your sister ever get it together to go to Nepal, here's our address. So I corresponded with Peter a bit before I left. And then he sent an aerogram in those days that said, well, get hold of us at box 224 Kathmandu. And it was like, okay. And then I was moving all of my stuff from Jasper back down to where our parents had a cabin in Harvey Heights to store it for the winter before I left to Nepal. And I picked up these 2 girls hitchhiking, and we got talking, and they had studied national park management in New Zealand at Lincoln College. And then they gave me, they wound up crashing at my place, they gave me the names Mingma Sherpa, Lakpa Narbu Sherpa, Nima Sherpa, box 224 Kathmandu. Oh.
It became a very important address.
And finally get all packed up. In those days, a lot of the flights went from Seattle on Thai to Bangkok. And I'm standing in the queue the first time ever to go across the Pacific. And I'm not kidding, this suitcase in front of me said, box 224 Kathmandu.
Wow.
And I got talking to the woman who's the owner of the suitcase, Dr. Joan Ford, who was about to do her first trip across the Pacific. She was probably about late 50s, early 60s, and she was about to go be the doctor, do a locum for 6 weeks, while the New Zealand volunteer doctors at Kundi Hospital, at the Hillary Hospital, had their time off in their 2-year stint. So we sort of traveled together, and she helped, because when I went to go knock on the door of one of the other travelers, a bunch of us stayed in the same hotel, I fell down the steps and sprained my ankle. And so Joan helped me with that. And then she flew straight up to Lukla, and one of the other Jasper friends and I walked in, and it was a hard walk.
Yeah.
And they were also building the road in places, so the trail had been cut, and but it was just a real eye opener.
Yeah.
And when we finally got up to Kundi Hospital, and here was Peter Hillary, Mingma Narbu, one of the Sherpa wardens, and Dr. Joan, all sitting having tea together. So we had tea with them, and then Mingma said, well, come talk shop later, the next day. Meanwhile, we went to a big Sherpa wingding with some English tree planting volunteers who were about to leave. Yeah. And, finally the next day I went and I was talking shop with New Zealanders and the Sherpa warden, and there was also the Nepali boss of the national park. And I got up to leave and said jokingly, do you want some volunteer help for a while? And little did I know.
That was the next 40 years.
Yes.
Yeah. So you spent the winter volunteering and helping create the content, I guess?
Working with the,
Yeah.
working on the content, some of it had already been decided on, but also just putting it together with photographs. And I did write a few of the texts for the first set of exhibit panels in the National Park Visitor Center.
Okay.
Up on the hill above Namche Bazaar,
Yeah.
where there's a great view of the valley looking up towards Everest.
Yeah. And you spent the whole winter there?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Cold?
Very cold. I discovered why Sherpas usually leave and go to Kathmandu for part of the winter.
Yeah.
Take a winter holiday. But it was a very snowy winter, so we had knee-deep snow for a lot of the winter. It was really difficult to go in.
Very little heating,
No,
very little...
just
The amenities that we take for granted.
No. It would be like staying in an Alpine Club hut for 6 months.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Outdoor toilet,
Yeah.
a wood stove.
Wood stove. And you met Ang Dooley that winter, did you?
I met Ang Dooley earlier in the fall.
Yeah.
Because she was the wife of Ed Hillary's Seardar, his head Sherpa.
Yeah.
And when we were talking to people, and they were very closely connected to the hospital.
Yeah.
So when we were talking with people at the hospital, Ang Dooley had come along, and then she's like, "Oh, come to my house." So I often wound up staying at her house, and she became. We still joke about it.
Yeah.
Like she's like my Sherpa mom, but she's about 4'6",
Yeah.
and she'd go, "Sherpa mom, very short." Canadian daughter, very tall.
Yeah. So she's still alive?
She's still alive. She's 90.
Yeah. And she's still one of your very best friends.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, gee. And so you worked with this group and put together that winter the content for Sagarmatha National Park Visitor Center.
Right. Sagarmatha being the Nepali word for Everest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Good. But in the spring, April, I think?
I had a job to come back to.
Yes.
My sister's wedding.
Yeah.
And so I came back.
Yeah.
And I was lucky at the time because I was in Yoho Park, and the bosses that they had started a project, or they were going to start a project to do capital improvements on the trails at Lake O'Hara, but it was going to take time for that money to come through. So they actually decided to do a pilot project on interpretation to convince the public coming to hike on the trails to be very careful, not to step on the flowers, to stay on the trails, and why this was important. And they chose me.
Yeah. Yeah. So you spent a few years living in field.
Living in field and working at Lake O'Hara.
Yeah. 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 And that was good. And down there in the dark winter in field where the sun never shines.
Right. Where, because we calculated, I think the sun didn't stop. There was no sun touching the house where I lived with a couple of roommates from about October 15th until February 26th or something.
Yeah.
Usually. And then I remember one day I had to go home to get something, and there was sun coming. It was early March, and there was sun coming in the window. It was like, oh my goodness.
Wonderful. Yeah.
But we'd often borrow the park's car and go up to Lake Louise for lunch and see the sun.
Yeah. 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 So you did that for another almost 3 years. Yeah. And then Nepal called you back again.
Yeah, I'd wanted to go back to Nepal a bit sooner, but sometimes there's lag times.
Yeah.
And I applied, and it was also saving money. An issue of saving money to go back.
Right.
And then I I also, there had been a lot of, information I'd heard about different festivals that happened in the spring and the summer, Sherpa festivals that I was interested to see. And I applied for leave from my summer seasonal job and got turned down. So I sort of remember walking around and, what should I do? And do I really want to stay with the Park Service? To continue would have been into more bureaucratic types of jobs. And I decided to quit parks.
Yeah.
So I handed in my resignation.
Yeah.
And then went back to Nepal.
Yeah.
And then met up with Mingma, who was the park warden that I'd worked with before in 1980-81.
Yeah.
And I did some volunteer work for him. He was doing a little booklet on mammals of Sagarmatha National Park, and also some other different things, and signage and stuff like that. And then he asked if I'd be interested to work with the abbot, the reincarnate Lama of Tengboche Monastery, on a museum of Sherpa culture.
Wow.
And I thought it would take a year or two. And it took 7.
Yeah. And what an honor, what an opportunity.
Yeah.
So 7 years you worked there with the Rinpoche, the abbot at Tengboche, on basically, creating the cultural center, and that morphed into the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, at first I wanted, I had this Parks Canada little mentality, and I said, Rinpoche, through the translator at the time, we really need to do a time action schedule. And he sort of looked, and then I explained it, and he sits there and he goes, there's a festival you should see in a month. And I should have known that this wasn't going to be 2 years.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the Rinpoche, about what was his name? Yeah.
Nuang Tenzing Zangbu.
Right.
So Nuang Tenzing Zambu was his name, given to him when he became a monk. But Tengboche had been established, it's not as old as people will say. It was established in 1914 when a village elder from Khumbu village, just above Namche, went to Tibet, to Rongbuk Monastery, that was on the north side of Everest, and was talking to the abbot of the big monastery there. And the abbot told him to come back to Khumbu and establish a celibate monastery, because the sect of Tibetan Buddhism, the Nyingmapa, that the Sherpas usually practice, usually had married lamas and practitioners before that. So this was a change that was happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s, towards having celibate monasteries within that sect. The Gelugpa sect with the Dalai Lamas, which was a younger sect, had monks and so on. Yeah. And so he came back, this village elder, came back to Khumbu. They actually talked about putting it where the visitor center now stands, but decided it was too close to a big village. And there was a remote ridge in the valley at Tengboche where they built the monastery. And then it was destroyed in the big earthquake of 1934. And the founder, Lama Gulu, who'd established Tengboche, was killed with the main temple, the Gompa, collapsing. And so the villagers again came together, raised money to start rebuilding the temple and the monastery. And in about 1935, a little boy in Namche was talking about wanting to go home to Tengboche and being quite precocious. And so his mother took him up to Rongbuk Monastery in Tibet, because at that time people just crossed back and forth across the Himalaya all the time. And the little boy was recognized as the reincarnation of the founder of the monastery. And so this was the Rinpoche meaning precious one, who I was working with, was the reincarnate of the founder.
Right. And he chose you to be the person to
they sort of
communicate his story.
I guess, I don't know what Mingma said. They were talking in Sherpa, and Mingma, the Sherpa friend, had taken me to see Rinpoche, and we talked, and he said, yes, okay.
And you spent the next 7 years just listening to his stories and turning them into the cultural center and into a book that...
The booklet came first.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, because he started telling all of the story of the Sherpas, and one of his criteria was that I only use information from him or certain Sherpa elders, or if I read something somewhere or heard something, was to check it with them. Somebody had translated and read Rinpoche a couple of different books, Mario Fantin's book on Mani Rimdu, and a couple of books written by climbers, and Rinpoche was quite appalled at the misinterpretations of the culture. So he was quite strict about this, even down to the 5th edition.
Yeah, he wanted you to get it right.
Yeah. So.
And what was that book called?
So that book is Stories and Customs of the Sherpas.
Yeah.
And he dictated it, it was just about 5 or 6 days. I was sitting there all day, and I'd be writing, and he was dictating in Sherpa, and there was a Sherpa woman who spoke English from 20 minutes down the trail, who was a designated translator. And so we did this for 6 days. I remember Steve Herrero stopping in on his trek and going, oh my goodness.
Wow.
So then it was a process of looking at it and turning it into chapters and topics to make it into the book.
Wow. And it's a fabulous book. You've got some copies on sale out here? Yeah. It's a fabulous book. It's the authentic story. And what I just can't get over what an honor it was that you were chosen. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't a decision that they took lightly.
Yeah.
No, good. And and in those 7 years working on that project, you changed. You became a Buddhist, a believer?
Rinpoche would often talk about meditation and the importance of meditation. And even when I would ask him questions like, okay, we have the prayer flags, we have the stones carved with prayers, the stupas, the Buddhist monuments, and also in trying to figure out, okay, how to pull this together for the display panels. And he said, well, he'd say things like, well, what's really important is that when we see all of these different religious items, it makes us think good thoughts. And when we think good thoughts, good things happen in the world. But he was very persistent in the whole meditation thing. So I started doing things like, after we'd finished for the day, walk down the ridgeline a bit, and there was this one spot where there was a tree and a nice flat stone, so I'd sit there for a little while and figure out how to meditate.
Yeah, but it really changed your life, you said, and particularly the Buddhist relation to death and the afterlife. And
right.
Yeah, change your life. And
none of us get out of life alive.
No.
It's what we all have in common, if there's anything.
Yeah.
And it is that, going back to the whole idea of the inner culture, it is that cycle of life.
Yeah.
Birth, death, and so on.
Yeah. And you started to become fluent in Nepali?
Yeah, I had to decide at one point, should I learn Nepali or should I learn Sherpa? But there were so few Sherpa speakers. Really the population of the Sherpas was about 5,000 people. At that time, the population of Nepal was about 11 million people. So it just made more sense to focus on learning Nepali. But I also learned a fair bit of Sherpa. And often when I would be speaking with Rinpoche, we'd have Sherpa nouns and Nepali verbs.
Yeah. Now, I guess the Rinpoche has died. Yeah.
I think he was one of the first. He died in October 2020.
Oh, okay.
And people don't say it, but I think he might have died of COVID.
Yeah.
Because when he was staying in a nice hotel very close to the monastery because it had attached bathrooms. Yeah. And he was 85.
Yeah.
And just having to go out to an outhouse in the monsoon was no fun.
Yeah.
But his nephew told me that it was really strange because it was as if a man who had lived 85 years at high altitude suddenly had altitude sickness. Yeah. And what he described was very much the symptoms of COVID.
Yeah.
And there were some Nepali trekkers who'd been going up. Sometimes the PCR test certificates it turned out were faked. So it seems that COVID went up to the Everest area, the Khumbu Valley, and he might have gotten it. Mm-hmm. And then there was quite a little outbreak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because so many people had, the nephew flew him in a helicopter from near Tengboche down to Namche and wanted to take Rinpoche to Kathmandu, but he refused. So they left him in Namche. And hundreds of people came to get a blessing.
Yeah.
And then Rinpoche passed away.
Yeah, so during this time, working on the Cultural Center and the book with Rinpoche, you weren't being paid. This was all volunteer work.
This was all volunteer.
So somehow you had to make some money. So you started leading treks. You knew the culture. You spoke the language. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you started leading treks for wilderness travel?
Right, well, because after about 3 years of the Cultural Center, I realized, the bank account's getting a bit slim. I might have to leave and go to Canada or someplace and start making some real money. Yeah. Occasions, like sometimes they paid for I had free food, but you can't do very much with just free food.
No.
And so I was thinking this and thinking, okay, how do I And I got, in those days, phones in Kathmandu were pretty scarce. So I got back to my little flat in Kathmandu. And here was a note in the door saying, hey, we really need somebody to lead this trek. Would you do it for us and we'll pay you X dollars a day?
Yeah.
From an American friend. So I started leading treks. And it was good because on one hand, the trekking season, it was, sporadic. So I could still do the Cultural Center work, fit it in. And it was also good because I had been so immersed in the culture, I really didn't know where to begin explaining it. I was just too close. Yeah. So in having to lead the treks, I then had to start thinking through how to explain these cultural topics to Westerners. and to the clients, because they would ask. So, the two things helped. I had the knowledge, and then with leading the treks, I learned how to share it.
Yeah. Good. And then you completed the cultural center. What did you have an official opening at any time?
Well, because what happened was also we had money from several different places for the cultural center, including leftover money from the 1982 Canadian expedition, from Cultural Survival, and some from American Himalayan Foundation. But American Himalayan Foundation, they decided to do to fund an electrical proposal for Tengboche, to put in a small electric generator on the stream that comes straight off a glacier below Mount Kantega, right below Tengboche. And I wondered if this was really a good idea, having the generator so close to, on a primary glacial stream. But they persisted, so then it was like everything was, okay, let's have everything done for April 1988. And we got the cultural center finished, even a few days ahead of time. And that the photo in the advertising for tonight's event was we finished it photographed with Rinpoche and the three monks who'd been helping me.
Wow.
Yeah. On steps outside the cultural center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was done. The book came out first in 85?
Oh, because the first was 85. This is the 5th edition.
Yeah.
And then, we'll get on to that, but later on, when I started the publishing company, we started publishing it then, when I gave Rinpoche royalties.
Yeah. So you had the book, the cultural center was complete, and then disaster.
And then, what happened was that the electricity, in the monsoon, you just watch the water go up, 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 and and with the water coming off of the glacier, and it coming through that little penstock for the electricity for Tengboche, it damaged the turbine. So then in October, there was no electricity. It was apparently repaired in December 1988, but it was on and off and on and off. And then the monks were they were using woodblock prints onto what's called rice paper. It's the locally made paper, with prayers to put in a big prayer wheel for the monastery. So they had piles and piles of paper and quite flammable ink in this office room next to the main in the courtyard building next to the main temple building. And the monks later told me they had an electric heater on. But the electricity went off and nobody knows what happened. They didn't see the heater when they went out for dinner. But partway through dinner, the electricity came on. And the next thing anyone saw was 20, 30-foot flames coming out of that room with the wind blowing over and then igniting the wooden lattice at the very top of the main temple building that caught fire, and the building, everything fell, and the building burned from the inside out.
So the monastery burned.
So the main temple building burned.
The main temple burned, but your cultural center didn't burn.
Well, it was a bit lower and behind, so a couple of the monks had shoveled snow onto the roof to keep sparks from lighting it, and so it survived. But it also, it was useful because any items that were rescued from the burning building, temple building, were stored in it. A couple of the monks told me They and a Sherpa who was leading a trekking group went into the building, and they were, running around and getting certain books, certain paintings, statues, and pulling them out of the burning building. As the one monk said, he said it was getting so hot, and it was about minus 30 that night. But he took off all his robes, and they were stuffing snow down their underwear to be cool enough to keep running around and getting stuff out of the Gompa room and outside. And they'd put an old expedition ladder up the side, because the entrance was burning, into a window. And they would pass books or paintings or statues. One guy was bracing through the window against the ladder, and then they would drop it down with ropes. So they saved a fair bit of stuff, but the temple had beautiful, beautiful frescoes that were all destroyed.
Yeah, wow. And then, shortly after that, you came back to Canada.
So then I came back here. It would also have been difficult at the time to get a visa, and because the coming year was an inauspicious year in the Tibetan Buddhist calendar, no work would start. So everything was on pause. So it seemed like a good time to just come back and in a way have one foot in each place a bit better.
Yeah. You said that the Rinpoche said to keep a foot in both worlds.
Yeah, keep two paths open.
Keep two paths open, yes. So you, 1989 to 1995, so for 6 years, you were back here.
In Canmore. Yeah.
And living in Canmore. Mm-hmm. We met then. We met again.
Right.
Yeah, and you started. You worked as a freelance interpreter.
Right. Well, there was one friend, Peter Duck.
Right.
And other friends, and also doing Burgess Shale hikes. Yeah. So I worked as a freelance interpreter or hiking guide.
Yeah.
But would still go to Nepal once or twice, usually twice a year, to lead treks for Wilderness Travel, the big U.S. company.
Right. And you started working on your book.
So I really wanted to do a book that, because Stories and Customs of the Sherpas is in the Rinpoche's voice and from his perspective. But I also wanted to write a book that also had my voice, and in looking at and explaining a lot of the different thoughts that I had about cultures and why people do things certain ways. For instance, this couldn't have been in Rinpoche's book, but, like when my sister and her husband were in Nepal, we ran into a Sherpa friend, and we were having dinner, and I said, "So when is your daughter getting married?" And the Sherpa friend said, "Not until she has another child." And it turns out that the Sherpa system was that after the engagement, the fellow had visiting rights, and it was expected that they would have a child or two before the final marriage ceremony, when the woman went to live in the man's home.
Yeah.
And I, people didn't talk about it that much, but I really felt like, why do they do that? And certainly it would be that for people living in remote places, the girl was then having her first child or two in her own family home, because it was all home births.
Yeah.
She was having it with her mom and her sisters and her aunts and people she knew well to help take care of her. Compared to the Hindu cultural groups, where the girl might have only known the guy for 3 days before it's off to his house, and then she's having her first kids with his family.
Yeah.
Who, definitely won't be as close to her.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was part of the idea with Gaiety of Spirit, was to be able to bring in some of my interpretations.
Right. right? So you worked on that for a number of years because it didn't come out for quite a while.
Right, and I did a first draft and then showed it to a friend, actually another who also led treks for the same company, but who had a small company in California. And Roger said, well, lots of good information here, but you should start writing it over.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, with what you want to say, you need to be there.
Yeah.
A bit. You know, you instead of just saying that I needed to be at times be in the book.
Yeah.
So I started over.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, now back to Canmore in this period, about 1990, that's when we spent a lot of time together.
Right.
Together, you and I, Tim and Sherry Odger, Meg Nix, Len Upton,
Colleen Campbell.
Yeah, we formed a group called Beaucord.
Right.
I think you were the first president. Yeah, Beaucord Organization for Responsible Development. And it was meant to fight Three Sisters. And yeah, way back then.
Three Sisters Phase 1.
Phase 1. So we did win a war. We saved the Wind Valley, or were at least partly involved in that.
There's a coalition of many different groups.
There was many
Bow
groups
Valley
fighting
Naturalists
that.
and everybody,
So Wind Valley was not developed, but as I interpret it, they got permission to build on virtually everything else, and of course the battle is still going on, and as you all know more about it than me. But yeah, we spent a lot of time. It started around Tim and Sherry's kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The kitchen table.
The kitchen table, it was very active time.
And when I look at the difference in terms of how people can interact now, you know, with the Bow Valley Engage group and so on, you know, we had phone trees.
Yeah.
And wrote letters to the editor.
We did, but you know, we had 350 paid up members. I was the treasurer.
Right.
Yeah, and $10 each. We had a pretty good bank account, and you know, with a phone tree, we could get 300 people out on the street. Yeah, it was a real good grassroots try. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that. Yeah, it's too bad. The battle is still going on. And then, so you eventually went back to Nepal again.
I felt that Beaucord was swallowing my life.
Yeah, was it?
You know, and it was all volunteer.
Yeah.
But it was also opportune that I was in Nepal and met people with the Makalu Barun project, and was asked, you know, to put in a proposal, and that led to contract work for the next 4 years.
Yeah, so this was on the Makalu Barun National Park and Conservation Area.
Right, to the east of Everest.
To the east of Everest, and you were doing interpretive work again?
Right.
Yeah.
We were both doing work to interpret the natural history of the area, because it is the protected area in the world with the greatest elevation difference, from about 400 meters above sea level to the top of the Himalayan peaks.
Right.
You know, to the tops of Makalu.
Yeah.
Everest is pretty close by, Lhotse,
and
so on. So it has, 40% of Nepal's birds.
Yeah.
And a huge percentage of the world's birds.
Yeah.
And plants and animals and so on.
Yeah. And you worked with a completely different cultural group, too, an ethnic group.
Well, because it was also for the first time really working with the national park bureaucracy for Nepal. But the Mountain Institute that we were working for also had a lot of, Ungduli's son was one of the staff. There was a lot of different people working for the Mountain Institute. So people I knew from before. And the Makalu area had so many different ethnic groups. There was 8 different groups of the Rai ethnic group. And their language was so, each language was so distinct that they spoke Nepali as a lingua franca to understand each other.
Right.
But it was very different than Everest, than the Khumbu, because so much of the time in the Everest area was based on religion and sort of the sacred and those relationships, whereas in Makalu it was hard survival stuff.
Yeah.
Talking to a village elder who said, and it was a place where the terraces were about as wide as this table, so they couldn't grow much food, and he said, we have 17 houses in this village, and 25 people work in Namche to send salaries back.
Yeah. Yeah. So you got to know a new area of Nepal. And, yeah. Completely new experiences. And then you told me the story of how your visa, you lost your visa. We don't have to go through that story if you don't want to. The work I was doing was through a grant from Global Environment Facility. Yeah.
And anyways, there were some complications with one of the Nepali bureaucrats. And so my visa wasn't renewed. But I still had a year and a half to go on the work.
Yeah.
But a few friends, other expat friends, said, the government is letting people start companies right now, foreigners, because Nepal wanted to join World Trade Organization. So there was no minimum investment.
Yeah.
So I started Mera Publications.
Yeah.
With my Volkswagen, my computer, my camera, and $2,000.
Yeah.
And I didn't even have a name when I went in with the registration papers. They said, you need a name? And I went, oh. And they said, well, think of one right now. I was like, Everest, Makalu, Mera Peak. And so, Mera, M-E-R-A.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a bit catchy.
And you were in, it was the business was the company.
Sorry.
That's your microphone. So you were in the business of publishing.
It was
books.
Twofold. It was publishing books, and it was also doing contract work.
Yeah.
Which wound up being contract work for different development organizations, mostly big programs.
Yeah.
That could pay for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Since I'd worked for Parks Canada, a real salary.
Yeah. Yeah. So this contract work for the big agencies all over Nepal.
Yeah.
That paid the bills because, of course, as we both know, publishing
Books.
doesn't make any money.
No.
No.
It's a labor of love.
It's a labor of love. Yeah, and we wouldn't change it. But so you during those years, for a number of years, you went all over Nepal. You said that you went to how many districts?
So I was doing a lot of work for 2 big programs. One was with the German Technical Assistance Program, funded by the German government, and it was green roads. It was a combination of green roads and food security, so people would be paid in food or cash to do the manual labor to dig rural roads, but it was done over a period of time where the first year they would cut like a wide trail and then let the monsoon rains stabilize the soil. And then the second year, double the width, and then the third year, make it yet wider. And then in the meantime, supporting communities along the way to start orchards, vegetable farming, and so on, and different productive activities where then they would use the road to get their produce out to market.
Right.
So I I did work for them for 12 years.
And what were you doing? What was your job?
A lot of it was field trips and interviewing groups within the communities. It was also doing annual reports.
Yeah.
But the field work was often looking at, okay, what was working, what were the good practices, and what could we do better, what were the lessons learned.
Yeah. And you went everywhere in Nepal, almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. What were the numbers? You said you went to...
67 of 77 districts.
Yeah.
Because I was also doing work sort of interspersed with a British forestry program that wasn't in as many districts, but was a lot more in the east, whereas the German work was in the west.
Yeah.
Nepal.
Yeah, and then you published some books. You published the Rinpoche's book.
So I did new editions of the Rinpoche's book, and also finally finished Gaiety of Spirit.
Yes, 2009.
Yeah.
It's a fabulous book. It'll be on sale afterwards. And you took all the pictures except a couple of historic pictures.
Right. I didn't do the 1950s ones.
No, but your photographs of the ceremonies and the festivals, they're just fabulous pictures. So, yeah, get one if you can afterwards. They're fabulous. And full of fabulous information. And it's your story.
It's my story, but it's the day-to-day life. But I can use it, like I start the book with going to visit Angduli.
Yeah.
And because of the position that her husband had, having worked on expeditions and so on, I could bring in a lot of information about the Sherpas.
Yeah.
And then say other chapters, I put myself there. It's like I go in and I'm talking to Tengboche Rinpoche, and he starts talking about Buddhist religion or whatever. And so that ties in the explanations.
Yeah. Good. And then just before that, you started CORE.
Right.
Sort of, in a way, where this has all been leading to, all of it has been leading up to giving back to Nepal.
There was giving back to Nepal. There was also a lot of food for thought. Doing a lot of this work where we were looking at good practices. And there was a couple of particular field trips. And one, as it turned out, was with a woman who worked for the GTZ, the German organization, but had also started a small NGO about 15 years before. And we were just sort of talking about, we see these things, we make these suggestions, and they don't get adopted.
Yeah.
And there was one particular group, and it was in the middle of the insurgency, so it was kind of it was a tense place. Even the field staff were saying, "You don't have an American passport, do you?" With you? And I said, "I don't have an American passport, just Canadian." And we, because it was in a Maoist-controlled area, and we're sitting there, and the group of women sitting around, they all go, "We're the poorest women in the village, and we're part of this savings and loans group." And we're talking to them, and then way out in the distance, I see this woman in very thin, very, very thin, very tattered clothes, and carrying a heavy load, and it's like, well, she looks pretty poor. Why isn't she part of your group if you're the poorest women in the village? They said, "Oh, she's too poor to be in the group." It's like, okay, why is she too poor? And it was that she couldn't afford to pay the 50 rupees mandatory a month that each member contributed to the group fund. And so we got dissecting this, like, okay, well, why does it have to be 50 rupees a month? And why? And for people who are the poorest people, if they're doing wage labor, what they earn today, they eat tomorrow. As they say in Nepali, "Aza ayo bole kayo." The money's gone.
Yeah.
So this woman couldn't keep that much money, just 50 rupees, which is about $5, together to be part of the group. And so, there was incidents like that, okay, and what are the biggest needs of people? With urban migrants, it was often getting their kids back into the school system and so on.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that, and then Karen Barkley and I were on a hike up Mosquito Creek one time and got brainstorming.
Yeah.
First we thought of GLOW, Growing Learning Opportunities for Women.
Yeah.
And then eventually it was CORE, Creating Opportunities and Resources for the Excluded.
Yeah.
To just start a small Canadian charity.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do what I'd seen several other expats do, which was the foreigner starting a Nepali NGO, because as a foreigner you can't be on the board of that NGO.
Yeah.
And you might be bringing money, but you have no say.
Yeah.
Officially. So it just seemed much better to start a Canadian organization and then officially have agreements with Nepali groups to do the projects on the ground.
So you pass the money on.
So we pass the money on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's also then working legally within Nepal.
Yeah. 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 Oh, and one. Yeah. Anyways. Yeah. So. Microcredit and education were the original original things that you did. Yeah.
And part of that was a center for kids who hadn't been in school so that they could study at their own pace and then catch up. If a kid was 10 years old and they got a scholarship, but to start school in kindergarten when you're 10 is not going to be very encouraging.
No.
So this way they could go to the non-formal center for a year and then do a test to see where they would fit into the official school program.
Right.
And say a 10-year-old could then get into class 3, more appropriate for their age.
Right.
And continue their studies.
Good.
Yeah. And then we also gave scholarships.
Yeah.
And so on. And then the mothers had said, well, gee, if we had savings and credit, we could later on pay our kids' own school fees. So part of how we changed the whole system was to say, okay, let's have facilitators, staff go every day out among the street vendors or the garbage pickers and collect whatever they want to save every day. So if it's 1 rupee, 10 rupees, 5 rupees, that was okay. There was no minimum. A lot of the women went from saving, 5 rupees a day, and over the next years, they were saving 100 rupees a day.
Wow.
From their earnings as they
improved. And then they would reinvest the money?
And then the group had the fund, and if somebody had savings, then they could get a loan to either be able to, buy more produce to sell, whatever they... We encouraged it to be productive, but sometimes if somebody had an emergency, it was more difficult.
Wow. Wow. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but... and then, of course, you were there in the earthquake of 2015 and also through the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about those. Must have been very hard times in Nepal.
Yeah. The earthquake, I was very fortunate in where I just happened to be. I was at the recreational ground for the U.S. Embassy, in the center of Kathmandu, waiting to have coffee with a friend after the farmers market. So it started with sort of some shakes, about 4, and you know, you living in Nepal, you were used to lots of little shakes, but the shakes kept coming, and they kept getting bigger and bigger. And a couple of the staff had everybody get under tables, and I was under a table with a center pole, and literally holding on, and then holding on with my hands such that my head would hit on the pole. As the shakes just got bigger and bigger, and as it hit 7.9, it was like there was no past and there was no future. It was that moment.
Yeah.
You know, and you're just glad to be alive.
Wow.
Then afterwards, it was nobody knew how extensive the damage was outside of this compound, and you could hear screaming and stuff going on around. And a lot of us sat there. In the end, because the U.S., the compound staff, they made all Americans stay, but there was quite a few of us who were citizens of other countries who just happened to have a membership. And so we convinced them to let us go home. So we had this little convoy that drove, and we were expecting roadblocks. And there was very little damage. The palace all the way around the king's compound had fallen, former compound had fallen down.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a huge amount of damage that we could see. There was damage in the inner city, huge amounts of damage.
Yeah.
And in the Durbar squares, the palace, old palace squares, where temples had completely collapsed. You know, one temple killed 300 people as it came down.
Right.
And then it was days of just organizing. A lot of neighbors, you know, if you had a big yard, a lot of neighbors would come, and everybody slept outside.
Yeah.
Because you didn't want to be inside in case there was another big shake,
Right.
and buildings had been damaged.
Right. And then, of course, during the pandemic, you were in Nepal for almost 3 years continuously.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you were very active, your group, with the poster campaign.
Right. Well, also with the earthquake, Cor did a lot of relief work.
Did you?
And it was interesting because that was one of those rare instances where you really saw the potential of social media.
Yeah.
Because there were groups and people putting online, like, okay, we've got a truck going up to this district, and people would say, okay, I've got this food, or I had tons of solar lights, and then Cor was also paying for roofing iron with one of the groups where we'd been working in the south part of the Kathmandu Valley. So it became a very busy time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I personally didn't go out to distribute relief because it was mostly the strong young people who did that.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
And then with the pandemic, my staff artist at the time and I were talking about, we were working on the final drawings for this one book about a young reincarnate Lama from another part of Nepal, but knowing that probably there was going to be a lockdown, all of this was happening, and I just went, this is crazy. We should really be doing public health stuff. So I said, skip that, Alina. Do some illustrations of hand washing, of people wearing masks, and everything that we were being told to do at the time. And so she did all these drawings up, and I sent them to the designer, and he came up with a great poster. We had stopped the spread. We had some in English, but mostly in Nepali. And there's people here who donated, and other expats, expat friends, all kinds of people. We wound up publishing 13,000 posters
Yeah.
saying stop the spread, that went all over Nepal.
Right.
And at times there was 300 people distributing posters. There was a Rotary youth group that they networked everywhere.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting to see what is the old saying, what a small group of committed people can do.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, and then today you're still more balls in the air than ever. You're writing books. Core is still active.
Right.
Yeah, and then you're working back for the park center. Yeah.
Well,
So you've got all these things going on.
It was a surprise this spring when Tenzing Norgay's sons approached me. They had taken on the renovation of the old National Park Visitor Center that I had first worked with the New Zealanders on in 1981. And they had it renovated, and they didn't have any content to go inside it. And the big 70th anniversary event was 2 months away, or just over 2 months at the time. So they hired me, and I wound up doing, it felt like 6 months' work in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
But we divided it into phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 got done for the event, and people were happy.
Good.
And when I get back to Nepal, we'll start phase 2. Although I've been nagging people, including you, for photographs.
Yeah. I gave her.
While I've been here.
I gave you a copy of a fabulous picture of Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse from Pumori, taken by Tim Odger in 1977. Yeah, a fabulous picture, and I just happen to have the scan of it.
Right.
So that'll go in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're doing books? You've got more books?
So there's books. There's one book about a woman who, she was a friend of mine. She'd been a Magnum photographer, and for instance, in 1959, photographed the Dalai Lama. He'd just come out of Tibet, and he was getting onto his first train in India.
Yeah, and you're doing a book on her.
And then eventually she became quite disillusioned with professional photography, just photographing disasters and floods, wars, everything, and eventually became a Buddhist nun.
Yeah, good. Good, so you're, and Mera Publications is now 24 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
I
Still
can't
publishing.
believe it.
Yeah, still publishing. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And you're going back to Nepal in just a couple of days, 3 days. Yeah, back to work. And Nepal, you were telling me about how Nepal has changed. And do you want to talk a little bit about the good and the bad and what's happening?
Right. I think there was, especially in the 1980s or 70s, everybody had this very idyllic notion about Nepal because it was a kingdom, and and it was very strictly forbidden to speak about politics in those days. Yeah. What we didn't know was how many people who were political prisoners and so on. So there had been political unrest in 1980, although sort of the democratic movement lost out. So it had remained, Nepal had remained an absolute monarchy. Then in 1990, there was huge demonstrations. For most of that time, I was leading a trek up in the Everest area. And we sort of came down and didn't know what to expect, whether we could get our group of Americans out on flights from Lukla, and only to suddenly discover that the king had given in.
Okay.
And so there was huge jubilation, and King Birendra at the time gave in, and Nepal became a constitutional monarchy.
Right.
That, unfortunately, didn't always, people were impatient. I have very mixed feelings. There was some good stuff going on with local development, but it needed more time. But there were also communist parties that started an insurgency. It was a Maoist insurgency, but they were not connected to China. They were actually more connected to the Maoist movement in India. Maoist being that they work first in the countryside and surround the cities. Whereas apparently Russian communism started in the cities and then spread to the countryside. So the insurgency went on from 1996 to 2006, when again in 2006 there was huge demonstrations, and it looked like a situation that wasn't going to resolve. The night that it did, actually, because Karen Barkley was there, and we'd had a little going away party because Canada was evacuating people with the organization she worked for. And all of a sudden, she calls me and says, are you listening to the news on the TV? And I went, no. And so she held the phone up towards the TV, and it was, I could hear in Nepali, the king gave in and said that the parliament would sit. So Nepal went back into being a constitutional monarchy briefly until the parliament decided to become a republic, abolished the monarchy, and that was 2008, 2009-ish. Then, with the new constitution, Nepal became a federal republic, but the federalism reorganized local government groups such that the local municipalities can raise money and can raise taxes. So now my company, we pay the rent tax and so on to the municipality where we're based. But immediately after the election, where the first federal municipal council took power, 2 days later, the council in Khumbu, the Everest area, said, okay, no more of these Central Nepal Tourism Board permits, because those permits never went back to the community, the money from them. From now on, you need a municipal permit, same amount of money. And they're fixing trails and bridges.
Good. Well, it's been a rocky road for Nepal, but it seems like it's getting better. It's working. They're working their way through it. Yeah. Good. And just to finish it off, you're talking about, you've been telling me about how this Sherpa culture, this rich history and tradition, although Sherpa people live all over the world now, they're educated, they're modern, the traditions and the culture is still strong.
Right.
Yeah. And you can go to a Sherpa wedding in New York City or Vancouver.
Right. Well, because this one story I really like is there have been a lot of Sherpas who've migrated to New York City looking for, if their villages were off the tourist track, it was hard livelihoods. So came to be quite a few Sherpas and Himalayan people, other valleys in the Himalaya, in Queens. And then an old church was for sale. So they all put money together and bought this old church and have turned it into a Buddhist gompa.
Excellent. Yeah. Good. Wow. Well, we covered a lot, Frances. Yeah. You're losing your voice. You've been
I'm sorry.
talking a lot. It's okay.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add? Or?
No, I guess that is to sort of keep, as I was saying at the beginning, is sometimes, especially with the news and the unrest in the world today, is to keep in mind that so many cultures Well, on the outside, we're also different. On the inside, we've got so much in common. You know, how we go through a lifetime and how we go through the passage of a year. You know, and always remembering that, you know, with deities, whichever deities they are from whatever religion, they're right there inside. Thank you. Thank you.
Good.